Happy Thursday. Happy Thursday. It is third Thursday of the month, and I am Candi Cylar with SBC 21, and I am super excited to be here with you today. If you're new to us, let me tell you a bit about SBC 21. You're here today to eat with us and learn with us. SBC 21 is strengthening the Black church for the 21st century, and we want to bring you the best and the brightest information. So thanks for joining us today. Our Leadership Forward program is an opportunity to encourage, enhance, and empower our leaders, educate them to be the best and the brightest. And today, we have a not so popular topic that we're going to discuss, and I'm super excited to bring this to you. Performance maintenance. Performance maintenance in your ministry. We know a lot of our churches are small in numbers, but we're run by volunteers. Well, what is the performance maintenance there? How are you checking in with them? What does that look like? Then our larger churches that actually have staff led it's a staff-led organization. And how are you checking in with them? Just because they're larger in number doesn't mean that they have proper processes and procedures in place. So I always bring you the best and the brightest, don't we? SBC 21 sure does. And today is like no other. We are bringing to you my sister in three ways. She's my sister in Christ. She is my sister from the best university in the world, Tuskegee University. And she is my sister from the best, the brightest, and the finest organization, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. So join me with a round of applause, some cheers, and open your hearts, your minds, and your ears and get ready to take notes. While Quionna Allen, who is the founder and chief principal of the Caldwell agency. I'm sorry, Caldwell Allen Consulting Company. And so she is joining us today, bringing her years of experience as an HR consultant, as an HR strategist and director. Her organization helps you with strategic execution enhancement, leadership alignment, and talent strategy. So if you are interested in knowing more about Quionna, I am going to put her LinkedIn profile in the chat and you can learn more. I don't want to take away any time for what she has for us. I have my notebook and my pen in hand ready to learn. Welcome, Quionna.
Thank you so much, Candi. It is great to be here with all of you. I see Sonia is from Baton Rouge eating a sandwich and chips. I'm originally from Baton Rouge. I live in Atlanta now, and I'm really excited to be here with you. Hello, and thank you for being here. I'm really excited to have this conversation, really because it's one that's just close to my heart. I truly believe that every person has incredible potential, and part of my calling is helping people live into that potential. So, in my professional work, I focus a lot on helping organizations become healthier and more effective. But outside of that, I'm deeply involved in volunteer led organizations. So, I serve through the Tuskegee Alumni Association, my Jack and Jill chapter, and on a local board for an arts and economic development nonprofit. And as Candi has mentioned, and really as I've learned in all of these spaces, whether it's, sort of a big ministry team or a small community group, the real work gets done through volunteers. So people show up because their hearts are engaged, because they care, um, and because they, ultimately have a heart to serve. But the challenge is, even when our hearts are in the right place, it doesn't always mean that things will go smoothly. And so volunteers need clarity, they need support, and sometimes gentle accountability to truly thrive in their roles. So that's why this conversation is so important. How we lead and support volunteers matter, not just for ministry and or for an organization, but for personal growth and for their sense of really fulfilling and being fulfilled in their serving. So we'll talk about how we can do that both with grace and clarity. So as we mentioned, I'm Quionna Allen. I lead a boutique consulting firm, Caldwell Allen Consulting. We focus on helping organizations really develop their leaders, strengthen team effectiveness, and improve performance through practical and people-focused strategies. And so this conversation today is really about performance management and really some of the differences that we need to think about when we're talking about a volunteer group. So now that you know a little bit about me, I also wanted to just talk a little bit about where we're headed today. So we will be talking about why performance management with volunteers can feel so different and why it is essential. We'll walk you through, or I'll talk you through 3 key practices. So really setting clarity before you ever need correction, having caring conversations, especially when things go off track, and then supporting volunteers so that they can truly thrive. And then we'll just wrap up with some quick takeaways, and we'll also have some time for your questions at the end. So I'd like to start with also understanding a little bit more from your perspective about what are the biggest challenges that you face with leading volunteers. So if you will put that in the chat, what are some of the challenges that you face with leading volunteers? Limited bandwidth, inconsistency, yeah, consistent level of commitment, getting past the hesitancy to start the project, yeah, lack of accountability. That's another good one. Cooperation and positivity. So limited time and tying it to the larger vision. Yeah, thank you for putting these in the chat. It can be, all of these things that you're mentioning are certainly a challenge. People taking initiative is another one that comes to mind, and just, kind of figuring things out, as we go is sometimes needed in a volunteer role, and can be a struggle. And so when we think about ministry, we know the heartbeat is volunteers and people showing up with their time and their energy and really their love for the mission, for the work, and for serving. Um, but let's be honest, leading volunteers can definitely be different than managing staff. There's no paycheck. Oftentimes there's not a formal structure, and and what we also find is there's often a much more personal relationship. And when we have some of those personal relationships, it can make it feel just really awkward, and really be tricky to hold people accountable or to create more accountability. I'm curious about your thoughts just on the difference between, the staff and volunteers. And so, true or false, you can put this in the chat. Is it harder to hold volunteers accountable than paid staff? Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Yeah. So we're all sort of in alignment there. And I'm curious if what comes to mind in terms of for you, what you think is different with managing, creating accountability for paid staff versus volunteers. Talk a little bit about why it feels so different, and then I'll come back to your comments that are in the chat. It can feel different, oftentimes, but maybe not so much. I mean, this could actually be a similarity, is that volunteers are often leading with their hearts. They're not they're not there for the paycheck because they're giving their time. They're serving out of a calling, out of a passion, and sometimes even out of a sense of duty to God or the community. And because the relationship is more personal, it can feel harder to give feedback or ask for accountability when things don't go as planned, because you know that people are giving, you know, sometimes giving what's extra or additional compared to all of the other things that are going on in their lives. And so it can be hard when you know that folks are managing multiple things in their own lives to then request of them, these additional things that you're looking for from the volunteer role. So what do we often do? Oftentimes we'll avoid the conversation. I've seen this. In some cases, I've done it. And we quietly pick up the slack ourselves, or we hope that it just resolves on its own. But over time, the approach creates frustration and really burnout. Burnout, particularly for the people who are having to pick up for those who may not be contributing in the same way as a volunteer. And sometimes it can cause, just resentment for us and the other volunteers who are following through and who are, moving forward with the things that we are, kind of asking about. And so loving people well includes helping them serve well. And that's why this topic is so important and why this topic matters. Um, Looking in the chat, I see, volunteers can be hard to recruit. Pay versus willingness to give of their time. Um, so yeah, thank you for that. So there's some consistency just in terms of what you're experiencing and seeing as well. So let's talk a little bit about the impact, right? So when we avoid having these conversations, the ministry still feels the impact. Some opportunities to serve will, just get missed. The faithful few often end up carrying just more than they should, carrying more of the workload. And over time, just quiet frustration and burnout can start to creep in. And not just for you as a leader, but for other volunteers. And so sometimes the volunteer who's struggling just slowly drifts away, and we miss a chance to help them grow. This might be something that they really have a passion for, or a way that they're looking to grow as an individual. And, having some accountability can help them be, the best person and the best version of themselves. And then ultimately, the overall ministry can suffer when we're avoiding some of those conversations and avoiding those issues. We also miss the chance to help a volunteer to sort of deepen their own sense of stewardship and spiritual growth through loving feedback and support. And so while it might feel easier in the moment to let things slide, just kind of over time, it definitely costs much, much more, both for the ministry, but also for the individual. Is there anything else that you would add in terms of impact of avoiding the issue? And, I know we're on webinar, and so I like things to be as interactive as possible. And so I'll, keep putting these questions out so we can, just kind of listen and learn from one another while we're on this webinar. So anything else that you think would be the impact of avoiding some of these issues, just go ahead and put them in the chat. I'll come back to the chat in a moment. Oh, actually, this may be a better way to ask the question. So looking at this list, I'm curious what you see most often in your ministry when we avoid these conversations. Is it missed opportunities? Is it burnout? Is it volunteers drifting away? Or something else? So overloaded faithful volunteers, burnout, and quiet frustration. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And this is again why it matters. And the good news is we don't have to stay stuck there. There's a better way to approach this that balances grace and accountability. And that's where, the three practices come in that we'll talk a little bit about. So I see overload and frustration, but also never seeming to quite reach the goal. Yeah. Yeah, it can lead to burnout, frustrated volunteers. Yes. I mean, I see the exact same thing. And it can be hard. I think someone mentioned this a little bit earlier to recruit new volunteers so that you can spread the wealth and spread the work. And so it does put, more burden or more work on those who are showing up and who are serving. Well, thank you for sharing that. And what's clear is we're not alone. We're all seeing these very real effects when we avoid addressing performance with volunteers. But we don't have to stay there. There's definitely a way to approach these conversations that honors the person, that can strengthen the ministry, and ultimately reflects the grace and truth of Christ. These three practices work together. So first we will focus on creating clarity, and this is really before we get into correction, because so often volunteers struggle simply because expectations weren't clear. I see this in some of the volunteer groups that I'm with. Um, Folks, they come in to serve. Someone was doing something a particular way, and we may have volunteers where we need folks to just jump in and take care of it. But in some cases, there's a way that we like to see things done, and it's important to share that information and pass that information on and create that clarity. Then, when things get off track, we know how to, have caring conversations, or we have the opportunity to have caring conversations. So ones that are full of grace, but are also truthful. And then finally, we will look at how to support volunteers so they're not just filling a role, but really thriving in their service. So we're going to take these one at a time, and I'll provide some, real examples and really tools that you can apply right away. So the first piece, we'll get started with clarity before correction. So this first step is clarity. And because unclear expectations almost always lead to unmet expectations, and we really want our volunteers to do well, and they often want to do well, but sometimes they're left guessing. What exactly am I supposed to do? How do I know if I'm doing it well? And then when things are a little bit fuzzy, you know, both the leader and the volunteer can end up frustrated. So before we ever have to correct or redirect, the most loving thing that we can do is set people up for success with clarity. There's an example that comes to mind. I sit on the board of a couple of organizations and for my volunteer-led groups and serve as the treasurer. And I often see where, so for example, we'll have new people come in, and I'm thinking of a financial secretary a few years ago who came in and just didn't have all of the information that she needed to do the role. This was her first time serving as a financial secretary. And while there's some information in the bylaws about what the role is, it's not necessarily spelled out. And so in that case, we ended up having the treasurer who was picking up um, more of the responsibilities. And so what that did was sort of leave a gap between that the separation of duties that we're supposed to have between those roles when one person isn't doing their part and the other person is having to pick up the those responsibilities, and especially when you're talking about financial secretary and treasurer. And so creating that kind of clarity on the front end can be really helpful to avoid some of those um, situations and frustration and burnout. So when you think about clarity, there are three simple areas to cover. One is just role description, even if it's just a few bullet points to help them know what success looks like. The second piece is really being clear about the time and commitment, how often, how long, what level of reliability is needed. And then third, always trying to connect the role back to the ministry purpose. Volunteers aren't just filling a slot, they're part of God's bigger work. And so when they can see that connection, it deepens their deepens their commitment. And different volunteer roles have, different time commitments. Some are more critical and they require, weekly focus, sometimes daily focus. Sometimes there are others that are a little bit broader. They may be things that happen once a month, every other month. And so it's important to be able to share that and set those expectations up front so folks know what they're getting into. So I'm curious for you, when you think about, let's say, one volunteer role that you oversee right now, which of these three is the least clear for that role? So you can type one for role description, you can type two for time commitment, or three for purpose connection. Let's see, time commitment. Yeah, time commitment. Okay, time commitment. Purpose and connection for one. Okay, that's and I'm hoping this, kind of helps to shed some light on where to focus and maybe provide some clarity. Sometimes, when you have a challenge around time commitment, one, it could be understanding what the time commitment is. The role could be new. The project could be new. This could be the first time that it's happening. And so until you get through it, you may not actually know what the time commitment will be. But certainly for things that maybe you've done and you understand, thank you for that, Paul. So time commitment can fluctuate for some positions. So there's some times when it's heavier and then other times when it may be lighter. And so even having that information and being able to share it can be important so that that clarity piece is on point. One, a clear understanding of the role descriptions, and two, clear time and commitment, expectation, distinction between employee and volunteers. Yeah, that can cause quite a bit of concern. Um, and it's interesting because even in my work from an HR perspective and professionally, taking the time to sit down and think about, what is the purpose of the role is so critical. And what do we need this role to do? And oftentimes, we don't, even even in corporations, that overlap can exist, that lack of clarity can exist, and it is uh, pretty much impossible to really have accountability when there isn't really a clear understanding. Because in that case, what are we actually holding people accountable to, or what are we inviting themselves? What are we inviting them to hold themselves accountable to? And so clarity is like a key, kind of key first step to really having strong accountability on a team, and particularly with volunteers. The good news is clarity doesn't require like a 10-page manual. It doesn't have to have a lot of steps to it. Um, One of our newer financial secretaries is putting together like a, kind of a policy, or what does she call it? A standard operating procedure, SOP is what was coming to mind for what she's learning as she goes through around the expectations of her role. But it doesn't always have to be that drawn out. It really could be as simple as putting together a one-page, sort of role at a glance sheet, or a simple onboarding checklist that can make a huge difference. And as you have a new person in the role, or even someone who's been doing the role for a while, but those transition points are a great opportunity to do it if you don't have it, because going into the role, or that person can know when they're going into the role, the information that they wish they had, that they may be learning, on their own. I'm just starting to serve as treasurer for my Jack and Jill chapter, and that's exactly what I'm doing. They're, bank account numbers, passwords that I'm getting in text and an email, and I'm starting to put that just in a Google Doc so it would be available. And I'm thinking that this will be really helpful for the person that comes behind me from a transition standpoint, so that they have everything that they need. And then beyond, kind of a role at a glance with just some bullets, or onboarding, kind of checklist. It's just regular touch points, maybe a 5-minute huddle before service or before an event or in the office can just be helpful to reinforce what's most important. And the other piece around the role descriptions that I wanted to mention is, oftentimes we've had people that have served in those roles before. Some of them may be operating or volunteering in the organization in a different capacity, but even tapping into them and asking them to just jot down a couple of things that were really important for the role could be a way to help create some of those role descriptions. And then obviously the new person who's in the role or the person that's in the current role can update it and that sort of thing as the role shifts. And then on the piece, I just wanted to mention this in the comment that was in the comments as well, is just the distinction between employee and volunteers. Um, and again, when I'm often doing this work, one of the things that I'm trying to do is have, multiple conversations and get vantage points from different people to help figure out what some of those differences need to be, what things we need to consider when we're talking about what an employee should be doing versus what things we should, the employee may need help with that we're going to ask a volunteer to do. All right, so let's talk a little bit about caring conversations. So this is when things go off track. And so you might notice that a volunteer is missing commitments, they're showing less enthusiasm, or making the same mistake, kind of repeatedly over and over. Um, and here's the thing, most volunteers don't want to disappoint. Usually there's they have a heart to serve, they want to be there, they want to do, kind of what's required of them. Now, sometimes we do have some personality challenges and there may be some other things at play. But even when those challenges exist, when people are volunteering and giving of their time, there's something that's important for them, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it. And so when those things are going on, there might be an opportunity to investigate and just kind of understand, is there something else happening? Is there any confusion? Is there overwhelm? Are there life circumstances that they haven't shared that could be getting in the way? And so curiosity and care are really key to, to understanding and being engaged in a conversation around this. So there's a framework that I wanted to mention around this in terms of having the conversation, and I call it the grace and truth framework. And so how you address problems, especially without hurting a relationship, is important to know. And so it starts with grace, truth, and then next steps. And so first you just, you lead with grace, acknowledge that their heart and acknowledge their past contributions. The other thing that I would kind of add here is there's usually something that really matters to the person, um, that even has them volunteering in the first place. And so if you are also aware of that, you can acknowledge that in kind of the grace portion of the conversation. And then you gently bring in the truth. And so you would name the specific gap or issue that you've noticed. And then finally, you can talk about next steps together. And so, whether that's adjusting the role or maybe it's just some feedback that you can or guidance that you can give to help the person get on track. In some cases, it may even mean, releasing them from the volunteer role that they're in. But the point is to keep the conversation clear, and to, lead with care when you're having the conversation. I want to talk a little bit about, what this might sound like or what this could look like. And so with this particular scenario, we have a volunteer on the hospitality team that has been missing their rotation and others are having to pick up the slack. And so it would look like starting the conversation with grace. Sarah, I really appreciate how warmly you connect with people. Your smile has made such a difference in helping guests feel welcome. And then the next piece would be the truth. I've noticed that in the last, the last few times you were scheduled, you weren't able to make it, and it's been hard, on the rest of the team because they've had to cover at the last minute. And so next steps would be, I just wanted to check in on, to see what's going on. Is this still the right season for you to serve in this role, or do we need to, adjust something? And, when we start with grace, it really affirms their value. Then we move to truth, and we really want to name the gap, and then finally invite them into next steps. Our tone, we want it to be, caring and curious and not condemning. And often this can help us uncover, the real reason behind the issue and find a better solution together. Um, One of the presidents of organization I was with recently had to, kind of talk through this with someone who was in a critical role. I mean, they were serving as treasurer for the organization, and that person had just not picked up the slack. And it wasn't, and other people were trying to do things, but really things were just getting missed and stopped, and things weren't getting paid. And so ultimately, there had to be a couple conversations about, what was going on and what was getting in the way. And some of this she ended up using in terms of just sharing, this might not be the time that you can take on this role, but there may be another role that, we could have you fill for the organization that just doesn't require as much, as the treasurer role did. And ultimately, she, stepped down, and they were able to appoint a new treasurer. So what I'd like you to do is think about a conversation maybe that you've been avoiding with a volunteer. And I'm curious which part feels hardest: leading with grace, naming the truth, or asking for next steps, or something else. So thinking about a volunteer, a conversation with a volunteer that maybe you've been avoiding, or even one that you may have had recently. And then thinking through leading with grace, naming the truth, or asking for next steps. What what feels the hardest? Or maybe none of it feels hard. Thank you, Paul. So naming the truth that the individual may not have the gifts for the position. Yeah, naming the truth. Yeah. And if we were live, I would ask you, what makes it hard? The conversation can be hard if you let it go too long. Yeah, that's true. Um, and some of these, are more critical, and so we have to have those conversations, kind of earlier than other times. Okay. Yeah. Let's see, Tracy, dealing with the truth because it may get offensive. I don't like saying things that may be perceived as offensive. Yeah. And then I like this format as it helps me to approach it better. Usually I forget to lead with grace. It can be hard to remember to lead with grace. And with that, remembering that there is a why. I mean, to volunteer takes something. Um, and that can be a part of what gets acknowledged. Yeah, sometimes they're just not in the right position. Sometimes they're just not in the right position. And sometimes that, and then the part around the truth is really just what you've been observing. It's that gap that gets created. And so whether it's someone that's having to fill in or it's work that isn't getting done, that truth part is just sharing what the impact has been on the ministry or on the church or whatever team that they may be serving on. And the cool thing about having the conversation and moving into that next steps piece is it really then becomes around, you can have a conversation around what do they like to do. Sometimes when I'm identifying or working to identify volunteers for different positions, when I have that information, what do they like to do? What are they most, what are their gifts? It can be a little bit easier to make sure that they're in the right position. Or if they don't have the experience, are they motivated to learn? Sometimes people want to use volunteer experiences to gain additional experience in a particular area. And so as long as the right motivation is there, sometimes you can work through not having the skills at the moment. All right. Well, let me move through a couple of more pieces. I want to get to Q&A and a chance for you to ask questions. The last piece of the support puzzle is, well, before I get there, not everyone who has performance issues means that they need to step down completely. Sometimes, as we were just talking about, they're in the wrong role, or they need a little coaching or a little encouragement, and so we can just redirect them. But maybe there is a time when we have to talk about releasing someone, and that can actually be the, most caring choice. And so if something in their life has changed, I mean, when I think about this treasurer, for example, it was too much. She had too much going on personally to be able to do both, and doesn't make her a bad person or not even capable in that case. I mean, because she did have the skills to do it. It just may not have been the right time for her to serve in that role. And so, having these conversations can actually serve as the best way to sort of free them up, so that they can serve in a more life-giving way. Because it has to be, stressful for the other person too when they're in these roles, and not able to deliver in the way that they had hoped. So the last piece is just support to thrive. Um, So volunteers just don't need clarity about what they do. They also need encouragement, connection, and sometimes a little extra help to stay motivated. And so when we can create a culture of support, we can also prevent burnout, and help keep people engaged and help them experience really the joy and, kind of fruitfulness and what we get back when we do serve. And support doesn't have to be complicated. It could be as simple as a quick thank you, a regular check-in, just to ask how things, how they're really doing. A little coaching when they're unsure, maybe pairing them with someone who's done that work before, who can serve as a mentor. And these kind of small touches just help volunteers feel valued, and also just recognizing their impact, reminding them of their service and why it matters and who it's supporting and helping really in the lives of others. And so when volunteers, are in an environment where they're able to get feedback, it especially in a natural and a healthy way, um, that's important and really can create some normalcy around receiving feedback. And so just start small. Keep it two-way. Oftentimes when we're offering, especially if we've been doing something for a while, we'll just share and, plant all of the seeds, but we're not allowing sort of that two-way feedback and listening to what some of the challenges are. Maybe things have changed from when we did that particular role. And asking questions about what's working and what's been hard for them can really open the dialogue to figure out what else they may need. And then, of course, celebrating the wins, and helping them learn from any mistakes. All right. I'll close with this and then open up um, the floor for any questions that you may have. So, just key takeaways around leading volunteers with care and clarity, creating clarity before you correct, that setting those expectations, creating alignment around that is really important. Caring conversations, so really addressing the issues with grace and truth, and then supporting them to thrive. Those check-ins, asking how things are going, really making sure that there's two-way feedback. So I want to offer up some recommendations. One, um, pick a one volunteer role that you want to bring more clarity to this month. Where can you put together a role at a glance? I have a template that I can share that just has some thoughts around a role at a glance. Identify one conversation where you've been avoiding and use the grace, truth, and next steps framework to just have that conversation. And then find one way to encourage or recognize a volunteer this week. You may be doing some of these things already, but I'm hopeful that there are a couple of nuggets to either reinforce what you've been doing or plant some seeds for some things that maybe you knew to do and haven't been doing. And then loving people well includes helping them serve well. So I wanted to pause here and see if there are any questions.
Any questions? Feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or you're welcome to put your questions in the chat. All right, so while they're typing in questions, I just want to highlight your quote on loving people well includes helping them serve well. That speaks volumes. And I think oftentimes, in taking this from a person who has served in leadership directly in the church and organizationally, um, we sometimes are so afraid of hurting feelings, people leaving, um, people getting mad, but sometimes it's only a hindrance if we don't have those important conversations with them. Paul says, what are some best practices for inviting people to serve who have never previously served?
That's a great question, and one that we think about all the time. The funny thing that I find is reaching out and actually just asking. Um, Even when I think about re-engaging with communities that I haven't been engaged with for a while, what I'm trying to think if it's like 100% of the time, but what most often brought me back or had me engage was someone that I knew asking me. I've had a long time mentor who actually is a person that there's a reason I went to Tuskegee, reason I became an AKA, and she's very active with our alumni group. And she called. She's like, Quionna, will you come and, help with recruitment? And the next thing was, well, Quionna, will you be the second vice president? Quionna, will you serve as the president? And it just kind of progressed from there because sometimes we might have a heart to serve, but we have so much that's going on that without that personal invitation, we may not put our name in the hat. And I think that's something that when I reflect on that question and we're talking about how do we get more volunteers, how do we get more people involved, that's the one thing that comes to mind, and we just don't do it often enough.
I totally agree. And you have taken that advice and you did very well. All right, we have a question. Any advice for communicating with people in different generations? Very good question.
It's so funny. I was just at a summit last week for CHROs and talking about this very topic more in connection with succession planning and having multiple generations in the workforce was the way that we were talking about this. And it's interesting. We had a couple of things that we talked about. One, the generations are more similar than sometimes we give credit to. There are definitely nuances and definitely differences, but there are more similarities, and I think than we acknowledge, right? I mean, and one of the things that came up in the conversation was around flexibility. And so there's this perception that the younger generation wants all this flexibility. And when a colleague of mine asked the question to the room, how many people don't want flexibility? And there wasn't a person that raised their hand like, I don't want flexibility. And all generations were in that room. And so I do think some of it is doing some of the same things that we would do. But the other thing that I would offer is getting to know what motivates that particular individual. There were two things that came up in that conversation too on ability and motivation. You know, what is the person's ability, but what's also their motivation? And sometimes it's understanding that on an individual level, there are differences even within the each generation. Some that look more like baby boomers or Gen Xers that might be millennials or, you know, alpha generation. And so I'd say starting with just what's important for that person and connecting, connecting to the work or connecting the volunteer work to what matters to them.
Very good. There's a comment in the chat. Strong, stable relationships make recruiting easier. We tend to respond to folks that we know and respect. So I totally agree that having the opportunity to um, get to know people a little better, which means that doesn't mean go and only ask the people that you know that you built with. That means pushing you to build relationships with more people so that your reach can expand.
And I would add to that, even talking to people that you don't know, when we were looking for a recording secretary and I called the wrong Cassandra. Both of them happened to go to Tuskegee, but in my mind, I thought I was calling this one Cassandra, but I ended up calling a different Cassandra. And I said, well, since I have you here, and I apologize, that I, didn't have you in mind first, but would you be willing to, take on this role? And she said yes. I was surprised, but she did say yes. And so
Mhm.
building those relationships is so important because I lean on relationships quite often when I'm asking for people to come in and help. And I've also been pleasantly surprised that, even when I've looked through a roster, and reached out to someone to ask if they would be willing to help, that they were.
Hey, that leads me to a point of, and what I was saying is continue reaching, continue connecting. And I think sometimes we get stuck or we're tired but continue reaching regardless of who it is. When somebody new comes in your church, talk to them. Ask them, so what do you do? What are your interests? That should be your first question. And start making a mental Rolodex. So when something comes up, that's how you connect to them. That's how you connect them with maybe the right place of volunteering in the church. So, Quionna, we are so excited. There's some personal notes of thanks in the chat that people have shared. Um, to you. So afterwards, I really want you to take an opportunity to look at those. We're grateful for the people who that have joined us today on behalf of SBC 21. We thank you for this conversation. And I want to remind people that a lot of this is transferable into not just with your volunteers, but the people that you're also staffed. The way that you have conversations with them, not waiting until sparks start flying to have those conversations. And I love grace and truth. It's like the sandwich method, when you're talking to people, really take that opportunity to highlight those things that they're doing well and what you appreciate about them. But then get to the meat or the truth of what is actually happening. And that's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for me sometimes because you appreciate your people, but you also have a ship to run, you know, and you can't do it if everyone is not pulling their weight. So thank you again for sharing all of this great information. If you don't mind, we are going to post this to our YouTube channel so that other people can get an opportunity to listen and use these tools that you shared. Thank you all for joining us today. This has been another great lunch and learn. I told you we always bring you the best and the brightest. So take a second to just say thank you to Quionna. Quionna, my executive director is on, and he says, thank you for providing these invaluable tools for the small churches who don't have a staff. That is from our executive director, Dr. Michael L. Bowie. And we are grateful that he is on. So Sonia says this was an hour well spent. Thank you. Excellent webinar, says Paul. Renee says thank you. So we thank you so much for your time, for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom. And we look forward to potentially having you back soon.
All right. Well, it's
All
been a
right.
pleasure. Thank you. And I appreciate all of the feedback. I appreciate all of the participation in the chat. I I'm I much prefer the, sort of the engagement. So that was wonderful. Thank you.
Awesome. Have a good day, everyone.